My name is Elara Vance. I'm 31. And the moment I heard my aunt describe my grief as a management opportunity for the family trust, the part of me that used to care finally stopped breathing. I was sitting in my grandfather's wingback chair, the leather cool against my skin, while my relatives huddled on the sofa just 10 feet away. They spoke in hushed, practiced whispers, the kind people use when they're pretending to be respectful of a tragedy they actually find inconvenient. My aunt, Margaret, was already listing the burdens of the estate, the property taxes, the maintenance, the instability of my current state. My uncle, Silas, nodded solemnly, his eyes darting toward the antique desk as if he were already measuring it for his own office. They thought I was catatonic. They thought the recent collapse of my career and the weight of my grandfather's passing had finally broken the girl who always bent to their will. But as I stared at the tablet in my lap, I wasn't looking at old photos. I was watching the cadence of their greed. I didn't cry. I didn't defend my capacity to lead. I simply went cold. Something in the silence of that room told me that if I didn't start directing this play, they would bury me under the rubble of their concern. I let them keep talking. Every word they spoke was a signature on a confession I was already preparing to use. The air in the study felt thick with the smell of floor wax and staged empathy. Silas leaned forward, his voice dropping to that low, paternal register he used when he was about to take something from me. "Elara, sweetheart," he said, "we're just worried that all of this, the deed, the accounts, the legacy, it's too much for one person to carry right now. Especially after everything." Everything was their code for my supposed breakdown. They didn't see a woman grieving a man who had been her only true anchor. They saw a management opportunity. Margaret chimed in, her voice a sharp contrast to Silas's feigned softness. "We've already looked into a protected family account. It's the practical thing to do. It takes the pressure off you so you can focus on getting better." I watched her. She was wearing a soft, neutral sweater, the kind designed to make a predator look maternal. Behind them, their daughter Cressida was scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at the crown molding with an air of bored entitlement. They weren't there to comfort me. They were there for the vultures' vigil, waiting for the legal carcass to be ready for distribution. "I understand," I said. It was the first time I'd spoken in hours. My voice was flat, devoid of the tremor they expected. I saw Silas relax slightly, a tiny spark of triumph in his eyes. He thought the absorber was back in character, the girl who would surrender her inheritance because she was told it was for the best. "We knew you'd see reason," Silas said, reaching into his breast pocket for a pen. "I'll need to review the documents," I added, standing up slowly. I didn't look at the pen. I didn't look at them. I walked toward the window, looking out at the gardens my grandfather had tended with such precision. "It's a lot to process. I need tonight, alone." They exchanged a look, a mix of impatience and the confidence of people who believe they've already won. "Of course," Margaret said, standing up to smooth her skirt. "We'll leave the drafts here. Just don't overthink it, Elara. We're only trying to save you from yourself." As the front door clicked shut, the silence of the house rushed back in. I didn't move until I heard their car pull away. Then I turned back to the room. I wasn't going to get better in the way they wanted. I was going to get even. The vigil was over, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the keys. The moment I heard their SUV gravelly crunch down the driveway, I moved. In the stoic silence of the hallway, I felt like an architect of a building they no longer had the right to enter. I sat at my grandfather's mahogany desk, the very place Silas had eyed with such premature ownership. My hands didn't tremble as I opened my laptop. I wasn't just checking emails. I was building a digital fortress. I systematically began the digital freeze. First were the shared access points. I changed the administrative passwords for the estate's security system and the cloud storage where Grandpa kept his digital files. Then came the accounts. One by one, I flagged every financial connection to the estate for unauthorized access review. I could almost feel the phantom weight of Silas's hand on my shoulder, but here, in the world of encrypted keys and two-factor authentication, his paternal posturing meant nothing. By 10 p.m., I had revoked the guest permissions on the smart locks. If they tried their old codes tomorrow, the doors wouldn't just stay shut, they would log the attempt. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Margaret. "Sweetie, we forgot to mention that Silas has the contact for a wonderful contractor to look at the roof. Just let us know when we can drop him by." I didn't reply. I blocked the notification and moved to the next item on my list, the mail hold. I was cutting the invisible threads they used to pull themselves into my business. They had spent years treating me like a resource whose primary function was to be useful. They assumed the perimeter of my life was porous, that they could drift in and out as they pleased. I stood up and walked to the front door, engaging the heavy manual deadbolt. The click echoed through the empty foyer. It was a clinical, precise sound. For the first time, the absorber wasn't waiting for a blow to land. I was the one deciding who got to stand on the porch and who got to step across the threshold. The silent lockdown was complete, and as I looked at the dark monitors of the security system, I realized that for Silas and Margaret, the world was about to get very, very quiet.
The house was cold, but it was the kind of cold that brought clarity. I spent the morning in the library, a room that felt like a sanctuary of wood smoke and leather. I wasn't looking for memories. I was looking for the instructions my grandfather had left behind. I knew him. He was a man who understood that love, in our family, was often just a word used to soften the blow of an ultimatum. I found it behind a collection of maritime history books on the highest shelf. It wasn't a thick folder or a dramatic hidden safe, but a small, unassuming black box with a digital keypad. My fingers didn't hesitate as I punched in my birthday, the only date he ever bothered to remember without a prompt. Inside was a single high-capacity flash drive and a handwritten note. The paper was crisp, the ink dark and decisive. For when they insist memory belongs to the loudest person in the room, it read. I took the drive to the desk and plugged it in. The files weren't just financial statements. They were a map of the family's true intentions. There were encrypted folders labeled with Silas's name, containing redirected correspondence and unauthorized inquiries into Grandpa's medical status from months ago. But the real weight was in the final document, a video file dated just weeks before he died. I hit play and saw my grandfather sitting exactly where I was now. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, focusing on the camera with the same brutal clarity I was beginning to feel in my own chest. "Elara," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the quiet room. "They will try to tell you that you are fragile. They will tell you that your silence is a sign of weakness. I am leaving you this not just as an inheritance of money, but as an inheritance of truth. Use the encryption keys. Don't let them rewrite who I was or who you are." I stared at the screen long after it went black. He had expected this. He had seen the vultures circling before he even took his last breath. He hadn't just left me a house. He had left me the armor I needed to survive the people who claimed to love me. I closed the laptop, the encryption keys now safely mirrored on my own device. The absorber was dead. The architect was now fully online. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Silas's voice in the study, talking about management, like I was a failing business instead of a person. By 6 a.m., I was back in the library, the glow of the desk lamp reflecting off the physical documents Grandpa had kept in a separate, fireproof safe. I found it buried beneath the original 1960s deed, a folder that shouldn't have been there. It contained a printed property valuation estimate for this house, dated 2 weeks before my grandfather died. I turned the pages with a clinical detachment. It wasn't just a standard appraisal. It was a liquidation strategy. There were handwritten notes in the margins in a slanted, aggressive script I knew all too well. Margaret's. Quick sale, as is. One note read. Likely investor interest. Ideal transfer window, end of month. They hadn't been waiting for him to pass away to help me. They had been measuring the drapes while he was still breathing. They had already decided that this house, my only sanctuary, was nothing more than a resource waiting to be divided. The humiliation I expected to feel never came. Instead, I felt a strange sense of vindication. For years, I had made excuses for them, hoping that love would eventually interrupt greed before greed had a chance to fully introduce itself. I had been wrong. But being wrong about them meant I no longer owed them the benefit of the doubt. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of every page, every margin note, and every timestamp. These weren't just papers anymore. They were the paper trail of predators who had confused my kindness for a lack of sight. I tucked the originals back into the safe and locked it. The sun was beginning to hit the garden outside, illuminating the maple tree where Silas had parked his car the day before, watching me like a hawk. I looked directly at the street through the glass. I didn't hide. I wanted them to see me standing there, perfectly still, finally aware of exactly what they were. The absorber was gone, and in her place was someone who was just getting started. The study had become a place of clinical excavation. After finding the property valuation, I knew the family's public concern was merely a mask for private strategy. I returned to the black box and the flash drive my grandfather had hidden behind the history books. There was one audio file I hadn't summoned the courage to play yet. It was time-stamped just 11 days before his passing. I put on my headphones, seeking the isolation of the sound. The recording began with the heavy, labored breathing of a man near the end, followed by the sharp, unmistakable click of heels on hardwood. It was Margaret and Silas. They didn't know the digital recorder on the desk was active. They thought they were speaking to a man who had already drifted too far to listen. "We need to move faster on the deed," Silas's voice came through, stripped of its paternal warmth. "If Elara inherits directly, she'll sit on it. She has that sentimental streak that Grandpa exploited for years." "She's easy to corner, Silas," Margaret replied, her tone light, almost bored. "We tell her she's unstable. We tell her she's too fragile to handle the taxes, and she'll fold. She always folds when the pressure is applied." Then came Silas's voice again, colder than I'd ever heard it. "She's a resource, Margaret. Nothing more. She was built to absorb the family's mess so the rest of us could stay clean. It's time she pays the final bill." I sat frozen as their laughter, a small, polite sound, filled my ears. It was the sound of wolves discussing a lamb they assumed was already trapped. The recording didn't shock me as much as it hollowed me out. It removed the last excuse I had for staying blind. They didn't see me as a daughter or a niece. They saw me as expendable, a reservoir for their debts and a solution to their greed. I saved the file into 3 different cloud drives and sent a copy to my estate lawyer with a single subject line: "The truth without the price tag." The absorber was officially gone. I wasn't going to fold. I was going to ensure that when the pressure was applied, it wouldn't be me who broke. The clock in the hallway struck 2 just as the black SUV pulled into the driveway. Through the security monitor, I watched Silas and Margaret step out, their expressions composed into masks of somber efficiency. They entered the house with the practiced ease of people who believed they still owned the air inside it. "Elara," Silas began, stepping into the study and spreading a stack of papers across the desk. "We've brought the formal resolution. It's a standard transfer to the family trust. Once you sign, the legal weight shifts to us, and you can finally just breathe." I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I picked up my tablet and turned it toward them. "Before we discuss the trust, I'd like to review some curiosities I found in the estate's digital history." Margaret's eyes flickered. "Sweetie, this isn't the time for tech support. We need to focus on the deed." "I think the timing is perfect," I said, my voice cutting through her feigned warmth with clinical precision. I pressed play on the recording from 11 days before Grandpa died. Their own voices filled the room, Silas calling me a resource, and Margaret explaining how easily I would fold under pressure. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas's face went from paternal to pale in seconds. Margaret's mouth opened, then snapped shut like a trap. "It's out of context," Silas finally stammered, his voice losing its polished edge. "We were stressed, Elara. We were trying to plan for your future when you couldn't." "Is that why you ran a property valuation 2 weeks before he died?" I asked, sliding the printed appraisal across the desk. The one with your notes, Margaret, about a quick sale and ideal transfer windows. We were being practical. Margaret snapped, the mask finally slipping to reveal the sharp entitlement beneath. You were falling apart. Someone had to ensure the family didn't lose everything because of your instability. The only thing unstable in this room is your narrative, I replied. I stood up, looking at them not as a niece, but as the legal owner of everything they had already tried to spend. This isn't a negotiation. It's an audit. Every unauthorized inquiry, every recording, and every fraudulent valuation has already been forwarded to the estate lawyer and the bank. Silas reached for the papers on the desk, but his hand was shaking. He looked at me and saw, for the first time, that the absorber had stopped taking their hits. I wasn't the girl who folded anymore. I was the person who had just dragged their secrets into the light. The following week was a siege of a different kind. Silas and Margaret didn't go quietly. They transitioned from corporate posturing to a desperate, weeping urgency. Every day brought a new emergency, designed to test the structural integrity of my new boundaries. On Thursday, Margaret showed up at the gates, her face puffy, clutching a stack of past-due notices for Cressida's tuition and Silas's business loans. When the intercom remained silent, she began to shout at the camera. Elara, we are your family. Silas is facing a lawsuit because he counted on that trust. Are you really going to watch us lose everything over a few recordings and some paperwork? I stood in the darkened hallway, watching her on the monitor. It was the Thanksgiving moment of my own story, the point where the antagonists try to weaponize their own failures as my responsibility. I'm not watching you lose everything, Margaret, I said into the microphone, my voice steady and devoid of the old apology. I'm watching you live the life you actually built, instead of the one you expected me to fund. You're cold, she shrieked. You're just like your grandfather. You think money makes you better than us. No, I replied. I think the truth makes me safer than you. By Friday, they sent Cressida. She stood on the porch, looking small and confused, a final attempt to use my sentimental streak against me. She told me she might have to drop out of school, that her parents were falling apart. For a second, the old habit of absorbing the family's pain flared up in my chest. I wanted to open the door. I wanted to fix it. Then I remembered the recording. She's a resource, Margaret. Nothing more. Cressida, I said through the speaker, if you need help with your studies, I will help you. If you need a place to stay while you find a job, we can talk. But I am not a bank, and I am not a sacrifice. Tell your father the locks haven't changed, but the owner has. I turned off the monitor. The house was quiet again. It wasn't the silence of a breakdown. It was the silence of a clean slate. I had finally learned that no wasn't a rejection of love. It was the first honest inheritance I had ever accepted. They wanted me to save them from themselves, but I was too busy saving the woman they thought was already broken. The gardens were the first thing I reclaimed. In the months after the final confrontation, I stopped looking at the weeds as a symbol of my grandfather's absence and started seeing them as a canvas. I spent my mornings with dirt under my fingernails, replanting the perennials Silas had planned to pave over for a wider driveway. The house, once a fortress of secrets and vultures' vigils, had transformed into something else entirely, a home. The legal dust had settled with a quiet, satisfying finality. Silas and Margaret were forced to downsize, their management skills failing them when they no longer had my inheritance to use as a safety net. I heard through Cressida that they were bitter, telling anyone who would listen that I had betrayed the bloodline. But their words no longer reached me. They were broadcast on a frequency I had stopped tuning into long ago. One evening, I sat in the library, the same room where I had once listened to the recording of wolves. I wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. The windows were open, letting in the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant sound of the neighborhood waking up. I looked at the black box on the desk, now empty of its digital weapons. I realized then that they were right about one thing. I had been broken. But they misunderstood the nature of the break. I wasn't a shattered vase to be swept away. I was a seed that had finally cracked its shell to grow. I took the small scholarship fund I had established in my grandfather's name and began working with a local community center, helping young women who had been taught to absorb the world's messes learn how to build their own perimeters. It was the most honest work I had ever done. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the mahogany desk, I picked up a pen. Not to sign away my life, but to draft the plans for a new wing, a glass-walled studio where the light could hit every corner. They thought I was the end of a story, a resource to be spent until it was gone. They didn't realize that by trying to bury me, they had only provided the soil. I looked out at the garden, at the life I had built from the wreckage of their greed, and smiled. I was finally, for the first time, home. The piece I had built was not a fragile thing, but it was tested on a Tuesday evening when a shadow crossed the porch camera that didn't move with the rhythm of the wind. I didn't need to check the monitor to know who it was. The heavy, rhythmic knock carried a familiar sense of frantic entitlement. It was Silas. But it wasn't the Silas who had paced the study in a tailored suit. When I opened the heavy oak door, keeping the security chain engaged, I saw a man who looked like he had been hollowed out by his own shadow. His hair was unkempt, and the charcoal coat he wore was dusted with the gray of a long, cold walk. "Elara," he rasped. He didn't lead with a demand this time. He held out a small, weathered leather book. "I found this in the back of the storage unit. It was your grandmother's. The one she kept her sketches in." I looked at the book, then back at him. My heart didn't race. The old absorber would have felt a surge of pity, a need to bring him in and fix the shivering set of his shoulders. But the architect in me saw the calculated timing. Silas's final business venture had collapsed that morning. I had read about the liquidation in the local business journal. "Why now, Silas?" I asked, my voice as steady as the foundation beneath us. "Because I realized I don't have anything left of hers," he whispered, his eyes welling with a sudden, sharp grief that might have actually been real. "And because I know you're the only one who would actually care about the art, not just the value of the leather." It was a moment of profound, messy humanity. He was trying to trade a memory for a bridge back into my life. I reached through the gap, my fingers brushing his cold hand as I took the book. "Thank you for bringing this," I said quietly. I saw the spark of hope in his eyes, the belief that the door was about to swing wide. "It belongs here. But you don't, Silas. Not anymore." The hope died, replaced by a weary sort of recognition. He didn't shout. He didn't call me cold. He just looked at the closed door as I gently shut it, realizing that while I could cherish the history he brought, I would no longer be a part of his future. I sat in the foyer and opened the sketchbook. Inside were drawings of the very garden I was restoring. It was a gift of truth, and for the first time, I didn't have to pay for it with my soul. 2 weeks later, the jasmine was in full bloom, draping the garden walls in a white, fragrant veil. I was hosting my first design and autonomy workshop in the new glass-walled studio. There were 6 women there, all of them in various stages of reclaiming their lives from the people who had told them they were broken. Among them was Cressida. She had arrived an hour early, not with a demand for money or a message from her parents, but with a backpack and a humble request to help with the planting. We worked side by side in the soil, the silence between us no longer filled with the static of family war, but with the rhythmic sound of trowels hitting the earth. "They don't understand," Cressida said, her voice small. "They sit in that apartment and talk about when things go back to normal. But I think this is normal, Elara. Being responsible for your own dirt. It's quiet." I looked at my cousin, the girl who was once the silent spectator of my mistreatment. She was choosing a different path, one that didn't involve being a vulture or a victim. She was the first living inheritance I had ever nurtured. "Normal is whatever you have the courage to build, Cressida," I told her. As the sun began to set, the studio glowed like a lantern against the darkening trees. We moved inside, and I began the session not with a lecture on finance or law, but with the sketchbook Silas had returned. I showed them the drawings of a garden that had been lost for 40 years and was now breathing again. They told us we were the mess, I said to the room, my voice carrying the brutal clarity that had become my greatest strength. They told us we were the ones who needed to be managed. But look around. You are not the debris of your past. You are the architects of what comes next. As the women began to share their own stories, I looked out the glass wall toward the front gate. The SUV was gone. The whispers were silent. The air was clear. I wasn't just getting started anymore. I was moving with the momentum of a woman who knew exactly who she was. I was Elara Vance. I was whole. And the house was finally, completely, filled with light. Just as the garden reached its full height, a legal letter arrived that didn't bear Silas's frantic handwriting. It was from a firm in the city, representing a name I hadn't heard in years. The Sterling Group. They claimed that a portion of the estate, the very land the new studio sat on, had been used as collateral for a private loan taken out by my father, Elara Vance, nearly 30 years ago. My father had been the shadow member of the family, the one who had walked away when I was a child, leaving me to be raised by my grandfather and managed by Silas. The twist was agonizing. Silas hadn't just been greedy. He had been trying to cover a generational debt to keep the house from being repossessed by a third party. But instead of telling me, he had tried to steal the equity to pay off the sharks. I sat in the study, the audit of betrayal, now feeling like only half the story. The revelation wasn't that my family was evil, but that they were a recursive loop of secrets. Silas hadn't been the original predator. He was just a scavenger trying to clean up my father's mess by making me the sacrifice. I looked at the deed. If the Sterling Group was right, the foundation of my sanctuary was built on a lie. The architect in me didn't panic. I didn't call Silas. Instead, I went back to my grandfather's black box and looked for the one thing I had ignored, the maritime history books. I pulled every book from the top shelf. Tucked into the hollowed-out spine of a ledger titled The Silent Sea was a life insurance policy and a release of lien. Grandpa hadn't just known about the debt. He had paid it off in secret 10 years ago. But he had kept the release of lien here, never recording it at the county office. On a sticky note attached to the document, he had written, "Let them show you who they are when they think the ship is sinking. Only then will you know who deserves to stay on board." He had turned the family's debt into a litmus test. He had allowed Silas to believe the debt still existed to see if his brother would choose honesty or theft. Silas chose theft. My father chose disappearance. The emotional weight of my grandfather's test was staggering. He had gambled with my peace of mind to ensure I would never be tethered to people who viewed me as a transaction. I wasn't just an heir. I was the survivor of a psychological experiment he had designed to set me free. I drove to the county records office myself. I didn't send a lawyer. I watched the clerk stamp the release of lien, officially and finally clearing the land. The Sterling Group was likely a shell company Silas had resurrected to scare me into a settlement. I wasn't just safe. I was untouchable. I didn't wait for Silas to call. I drove to the cramped, two-bedroom apartment where he and Margit were now living. When he opened the door, the smell of stale coffee and desperation drifted out. The Sterling Group. Silas? Really? I asked, holding up a copy of the recorded release. The color drained from his face, but for the first time, he didn't reach for a lie. He sat down on a plastic chair in the hallway and put his head in his hands. We were underwater, Elara. Elias left us with nothing. Your grandfather. He made me beg for every cent to keep the lights on. I thought if I could just get the house, I could finally stop running. You didn't have to run from me, I said, my voice dropping to that brutal clarity that had become my signature. I would have helped you. But you didn't want help. You wanted a resource. You wanted the girl who folds. Margit appeared in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed. We're your parents in every way that mattered, Elara. We raised you while your father was chasing ghosts. You didn't raise me, I replied, standing tall in the narrow hallway. You curated me. You kept me broken, so you could use the pieces to plug the holes in your own lives. I handed Silas a check. It wasn't the millions he wanted, but it was enough to clear his personal debts and move them to a place they could actually afford. "This is the final bill," I said. "Don't call me. Don't send Cressida with messages. This isn't a bridge. It's a wall. Built with the money you thought I wasn't smart enough to protect." I returned to the house as a storm was rolling in from the coast. The glass-walled studio hummed with the sound of the rain, but inside, it was warm and still. I stood in the center of the room and realized that the brokenness I had carried for years wasn't a defect. It was a pre-construction phase. I had spent 31 years living in a house built by other people's lies, and in the last few months, I had torn it down to the studs and rebuilt it on the truth. I looked at my grandmother's sketchbook, at the drawings of the garden, and at the release of Lean. My grandfather's test was over. I had passed. Not by being good or understanding, but by being precise. I picked up my phone and deleted Silas and Margit's numbers. Then, I dialed a new one. The community college. I doubled the scholarship fund. If there were other absorbers out there being told to know their place, I wanted to be the one to tell them that their place was wherever they chose to stand. The storm broke, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to hide from the lightning. I was the architect. I had designed the lightning rods. And I was finally ready to live in the light. They say that blood is thicker than water, but they forget that blood can also drown you if you don't know how to swim. My name is Elara Vance, and I used to believe that being strong meant carrying everyone else's weight until your spine snapped. I thought that silence was a sacrifice and that surrender was a form of love. I was wrong. True strength isn't about how much you can absorb. It's about what you refuse to let in. It's about the no that saves your life. My family thought they were managing a breakdown, but they were actually witnessing a breakthrough. They mistook my stillness for fragility, never realizing that the most dangerous part of a storm is the eye, the part that is perfectly, terrifyingly calm. If you're listening to this and you feel like you're being buried under the concern of people who only value you when you're useful, remember this. The people who truly love you will never ask you to disappear so they can shine. The door to my grandfather's house is closed to the vultures, but it is wide open to the world. I don't look back at the people I left behind with bitterness, but with a quiet, clinical gratitude. They taught me exactly who I didn't want to be. I'm Elara Vance. I'm no longer broken. I'm no longer the resource. I am the architect. And I am just getting started.